Morning, good afternoon, good evening. Um, Anyone who's joining us today, as you would have heard, we are recording this session. Thanks for everyone for joining us. We are on 12:30, so I might give a couple more minutes for any latecomers to join us, and then I will start the webinar session. But while I do that, I'll just share my screen as well. So we've got that sorted with. Just give me a thumbs up, Nate, if you can see it. Yeah, awesome, fantastic. Um, while people are joining us, Nate and I just spent the last 10 minutes talking quite deep and meaningful, meaning of life, philosophical topics and themes. So I hope I haven't put him off in terms of what he's going to be talking about today. Nate, apologies.
We'll be right, mate. We'll be right.
Yeah, brilliant. Look, let's get started. I'm sure people are busy. So welcome everybody to our first AI webinar series by Academy XI for 2025. If you've been part of this series, we've ran, I think, 8 or 9 webinars last year covering topics from, marketing, business, agile, startups, product design, and so forth, all in context of artificial intelligence. So we're going to kick off this year with a really with a fascinating topic that I'm really looking forward to hearing from Nate. But before I do, I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, of the Kulin Nation. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to their elders past and present, as well as the emerging leaders, and also extend that acknowledgement to any Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people joining us today. So for people who don't know Academy XI, we're enterprise and consumer education organization, wholly founded in Australia and owned in Australia. We're over 10 years old. And our mission is to empower the future change makers through teaching them digital skills, emerging and future digital skills. In terms of what we cover everything from business, technology, and design topics and themes. And obviously, application of AI is very much here and now. And so we've got a handful of training, both self-paced, workshop style, enterprise level, and sort of hybrid workshops and training around artificial intelligence. So by all means, please reach out to myself or the Academy XI team if you want to find out more. But today is not about me. Today is all about Nathan, or as he'd like to be called, Nate. I hope that's correct, Nate. So I've done a bit of a research on Nate to provide what I like to think is an okay bio, but I'm sure he'll do a great job himself. So Nate is an ethicist, organizational designer, and trust researcher. Some of the titles that he goes by are ethicist, organizational design, responsible innovation. He works in trust, transparency, ethics, and he's been doing that for most of his career. He's been an angel investor. He's a founder and a co-founder. He's been a CEO, and he plays in the academia space by guest lecturing at University of Wollongong, Architectural Association, and Arizona State University. So I'm very glad and happy to have Nate here to talk all about everything um, ethics related to AI and how we have a phobia, or as he likes to call it, ethicophobia. So look, without further ado, I'm just going to chuck the mic over to you, Nate. I'll stop sharing and let's get the ball rolling.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us. Whether it be in real time or watching after the fact. I'm also dialing in from Wurundjeri country. And it's, I think, the fifth time I've lived sort of in this part of the world now. And yeah, I've just felt this sort of deepening connection to country. And it's a great privilege, I think, to be in a place where there's human history that goes back at least 60,000 years. It's kind of incredible. So I just want to extend my appreciation, gratitude, acknowledgement, and respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Uh, as was referenced just a moment ago, we're going to be talking about ethicophobia in AI, and I'll define these terms and I'll give you a little bit of an overview of some of this stuff and ask you to participate a little bit as well, if that's okay. And then we'll get into some practical considerations for how we can kind of do some of the practicalities of AI ethics within our organizational context better. In order to do that, I'm just going to share my screen here, which means I won't be able to see you anymore. Um, so if you need to butt in, if something's really pressing, perhaps do so in the questions. Um,
And I can
and
interrupt you if
ab-
anybody has
abs-
something. Yep.
Absolutely, absolutely. If something, because I can't see anything other than, other than this anymore. So just mate, go for it, honestly. All right, so let me just start. Yeah, so a little about me. I wear many hats. Today I'm coming to you with my ethicist hat primarily. But you know, we're all complex beings with lots of different values, considerations, constraints, you know, our historical context. And I think it pays to just recognize how interesting, beautiful, challenging, and sometimes terrifying it is to be a human. If you want to find out any more about my work, over on the far right, and we'll share this link afterwards. There's a bunch of references I provide, and then a couple of things that you can just do to connect with me if you think that's interesting or check out my work any further. I'm not going to get too much into the nuances of what I do, other than say, you know, what we're really here to talk about today is really like a particular domain of applied ethics. Ethics or moral philosophy is part of philosophy. Philosophy is broken down into sort of big branches and sub branches and all this different type of stuff. We won't get into that today. The work that I do draws sort of on like an underlying philosophy, like a way of seeing the world. Um, you know, that's always changing and evolving in different ways, but it's informed by, yes, different branches of philosophy, many of which go back thousands of years, but also modern advancements in the cognitive sciences or complexity or system sciences, behavioral science, behavioral economics. There are different disciplines that I'm doing my best to call on in order to approach this work as effectively as I can. You know, on top of that underlying philosophy, there are lots of different practices and methods, and then they're applied in different application contexts. I've worked all around the world, done a lot of applied AI work, a lot of work in healthcare, financial services, a lot of work with government, a lot of different research work, a lot of teaching, et cetera, et cetera. Again, anything that you want to check out, please, yeah, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or check out any of the other resources. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do, and let me do this really quickly. I'm going to share. Yes, let's just go copy link. So I'm going to share this link with you if that's okay. Let me see. Where are we? Where are we? Can I pop it in here and see if this goes to everyone? If you can just jump into this link, I'm going to try get a bit of a foundational understanding of just where everyone's at. So if you can open that, or that has that just gone to panelists?
It's just go on to Mural, overcoming ethicophobia, log in, enter as a visitor, I'm assuming, and people can just put their name. So I'm just going to
Exactly.
here.
I just want to ask to the participants that are on though, has that link come through to you?
It should have. You've sent it. Oh no, you've only sent it to the
Oh,
hosting
wait, okay.
database.
My
So,
bad, my bad. Let me go everyone real quick. There
yeah,
we go. So
perfect.
if you can just open that, and then once you're in there, what I'll do is it's just called summoning. So I'll summon you. Um, and there's no wrong answers here, right? Like one word, dot points, an entire sentence, a few sentences, whatever works. Just double click on one of these stickies and then just type in, you know, to me, ethics means or ethics is or whatever, something like that.
Oh,
Great.
it's a tough question.
Yeah, and you know, if you haven't look, even if you have formally studied philosophy, you know, it's sometimes hard to define because it's one of these things that, in many ways, is a living process. But yeah, go crazy. Anything that comes to you is going to be helpful in terms of just framing the next few sections of what we'll work through together. Maybe we give it with time boxes as well. Just give it like 90 seconds or so, just so we're not spending too long on it.
And we need more than an hour for this one.
Now, sometimes the functional stress of creating, tight time constraints is really helpful. You just you get it out. Cool. Like if I think we're probably all done. Let's just move on. So again, I'll just summon everyone here. And I think I'm still sharing, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
You're
So
good.
so what I've done is because I don't want to reinvent the wheel. Now I actually have my own definition of ethics, but what I've done is I've gone to the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. There's some great team there that have done some really good work on something that they call tech ethics in practice. I've provided that in the references section of this, along with a number of other references. So let's just talk about this really quickly because there are a lot of common misconceptions. So ethics is not a set of fixed rules to follow. It's not a purely negative frame. This is one of the ones I often hear. Oh, you're in here to just tell me we can't do stuff. Not at all. Sometimes it might uh, encourage you to restrain a particular set of activities or direction of activities, and that's part of the process. But it certainly isn't a purely negative frame. It's not equal to legal or corporate compliance. It's not equal to a subjective sense of right or wrong. It's not equal to religious belief or a particular ideology or dogma. It's not equal to non-moral customs of etiquette. And it certainly isn't uncritical obedience to authority. So just because my CEO said it means it's right, means it's ethical. That is not what we're talking about here at all. Ethics is something more like promoting objective but context and culture dependent conditions of human flourishing, hopefully beyond the flourishing of just humans as well, recognizing we're part of this interconnected, interdependent web of life. It's also about respecting the dignity of others and the duties that are created in our relationships. It's about living as a person of integrity, principle, virtue. It's about promoting beneficial and just outcomes while avoiding and minimizing harm to others. It's about cultivating our own character so that we as people within communities can become increasingly morally wise and trustworthy. It's about learning to more expertly see and navigate the moral world and its features. And guess what? That requires practice. And it's something that, once you get into this stuff, you keep practicing it for life. And building upon that, it's a skillful practice or process of moral perception, sensitivity, and flexible and discerning judgment. So, as a top line definition, I describe ethics as something like the process that we execute in a given situation to reflect on our values or our first order moral beliefs about what is good and what is right in order to make the best possible decision we can about what we should do. And I think in that way, we are doing ethics much more often than we think we are. Now, we might not be explicitly referencing this rich body of philosophical literature, but we have values and we're often reflecting on them when considering what we should do in a given situation. And a lot of applied ethics, especially when we're talking about building socio-technical systems or AI systems, is really just about trying to do that process better, more diversely, and more formally, and finding ways to do that such that it helps us build better systems that help more people or do less harm, etc. Now, I'm going to zoom out for a second and I'm going to talk about why ethics matters in the bigger picture. Now, some of you may have heard of something called the meta crisis. That basically refers to the total ecosystem of all global crises, along with like the underlying dynamics that generate catastrophic and existential risk. And amongst folks that study this stuff, there are three key drivers that are often cited that you see here. So market economies with perverse incentives, externalities of growth, business and industry, and like group coordination problems such as multipolar traps. And I've provided a really brilliant reference if any of this is of interest to you, the bigger picture stuff over on the right, and we'll get to that at the end. Now, when you think of things like climate change or poverty or species extinction or toxicity in the environment, these are all really thought of as symptoms of this deeper process. They're all interconnected, interdependent, etc. And I would argue that ethics can help us work towards the most good and right responses, the ones that are going to give us the best overall chance of flourishing into the future. And in the big picture sense, that's its purpose. And if we fail to do this type of stuff, if we fail to embed our values and this ethical reflection in our collective decision making, we're very likely to massively enhance catastrophic risk. And that is bad for everyone in pretty much every way you can possibly think of it. Now, if we narrow our focus, so we've got really big picture, state of the world, humanity's impact on the biosphere, all that type of stuff, the gap between our power and wisdom. And we go, well, why does ethics matter within organizations? Now, this is a little bit of a how long's a piece of string thing because it matters for lots of different reasons. It matters based on the organization's trustworthiness, like its benevolence, its integrity, its competence. We know that the most trustworthy organizations outcompete the stock market by about 30%. And we have pretty good data on that. So the most trustworthy organizations aren't just probably like more morally or value sensitive organizations. They seem to actually perform better. And there's a bunch of other benefits, sort of like material and immaterial, that come out of that. But if we narrow further and we go, all right, AI and applied AI stuff or responsible AI, what we're actually seeing at the moment, and this comes from the Australian Responsible AI Maturity Index, which is one of the leading resources we have to look at basically the relation between what organizations say they want to do and what they're actually doing. And the gap has closed a little bit in the last year, by the way. So some organizations seem to be making some decent progress, but there's still a huge gap between the kind of like AI ethics principles that pretty much everyone agrees matter, that should guide how we develop AI systems, and how we're actually developing those systems. So getting better at the process of doing ethics can help us close this gap, which means more targeted systems, which means fairer systems, which means systems that better protect our rights and freedoms, like the right to privacy. It means more reliable systems. It means more transparent and explainable systems. It means the organizations building these systems are more accountable. And it means that the big human, social, and environmental determinants of well-being aren't negatively eroded through the process of developing and using these systems. So given our kind of like reliance on AI, given how many billions of dollars are being spent on AI, and given how much of an impact that seems to be having on lots of different things that matter in our world, to us as individuals, within our communities, and to society or to our economies at large, ethics is still a big deal. Now, we're here to talk about overcoming ethicophobia, and ethicophobia is just loosely the fear of doing ethics. Now, we don't necessarily mean that someone says the word ethics and you have a panic attack. We're not saying it's that type of fear necessarily. It could be the fear that, oh, well, if we're encouraged to do ethics more rigorously, then I'm not going to be able to innovate, so I don't want to do it. Or it could be a business leader going, oh, well, if I'm encouraged to reflect on my values and really try and ground our decisions in more rigorous process, then we're not going to be able to grow. And gosh, I have a fiduciary responsibility to this corporation as a director to maximize the value that I deliver to my shareholders. So, there are these types of fears that we're talking about. So what we're really talking about here are things that get in the way of us doing ethics well and benefiting from the process of doing ethics well. Now, in order to do this, in order to kind of practically overcome some of these fears, you don't need to go back to university and formally study moral philosophy. I think there are many useful resources that are out there that can help you get hands-on with practically useful information. And I think that you can really rely on meaningful collaboration with your colleagues and other folks who may have more or different experience at doing this type of stuff. But regardless of that, one of the things that I most commonly advocate for is starting tiny. And I mean this in sort of like a BJ Fogg way. So if you're familiar with the B equals map behavioral design method, which comes from BJ Fogg, who was the founding director of the Behavior Design Lab at Stanford University in California. The model here is very simple. What it proposes is that the target behavior is most likely to result when there is sufficient motivation, sufficient ability, and an effective prompt, all at the right time in the right context. And it's quite well tried and tested, and it's used in lots of different ways. So if we're saying that basically the target behavior is getting a bit better at doing this process of ethics, reflecting in these ways and making decisions in these ways, well, there's probably not a lot that we can do with motivation. That varies for lots of different reasons and based on lots of different factors. So we probably want to play more with ability. So that means we can start working on our skills, but we can also decrease the difficulty. And this is one of the most effective ways to get people to form new habits. We make it much easier. And one of the examples that BJ uses in his book Tiny Habits, and it's a really great book. I'd recommend you checking it out at some point. Is he never used to floss. And so what he did was he applied his own, and he has a very distinct process, and it's really simple to learn, but a very distinct process. And he started flossing one tooth a day. Every single day he had this particular prompt, and after the prompt he flossed one tooth. And he found that that was so easy. And then, after a little bit of time, he found it so easy. He's like, I'm going to do two teeth. And eventually he got to the point where he's doing his whole mouth and he didn't even need the prompts anymore. He was doing it by himself, right? Now, that's a very simple example and a little bit of a silly one, maybe, given the context of what we're talking about. But that's what I'm referring to here. So we want to start tiny, and I'm going to talk about some ways that we can do that. We also want to track progress. We want to be sort of like up above this tiny ethics work, this micro ethics work that we're doing, to see how's the work that we're doing changing over time? What effects is it having? Is it changing the way that we make decisions? Is it helping us have better discussions as a team? Are we better able to surface issues upfront and often, etc., etc.? And also, we want to stay the course. Ethics is something that you can start doing formally, but you can never end. You don't just do ethics once and then that's it. It's like philosophy generally. It's a living and breathing process. The same way that you develop a product and maybe you deploy a version of that. People use it, you're observing how they're using it, you're recording things that you're learning, that's feeding into a backlog. You're then prioritizing it based on different weighted criteria. The highest priority items then come into some type of discovery or delivery workflow, and you're improving your product over time. And you're just consistently trying to deliver more and greater value in more effective ways. And it's a very similar process that we're talking about here. Now, I'm going to give you two examples of approaches that you could consider using. And I'm going to assume, and the assumptions that I'm making, that they're not exclusive assumptions. So you don't have to be in these contexts in order to do this. But I'm just going to assume that you're in the type of context where you're participating in developing or stewarding the development of some type of product or service. You could be a product marketer, an analyst, a user researcher, some type of designer, some type of engineer, some type of scrum master, a functional business. You could play any of these roles or any variation of these roles. But I'm just going to suggest that the example is something like you're involved in developing a product or service. And let's say, because of the focus of today, you're involved in some type of development of a machine learning algorithm or whatever it may be, and that's being applied and put to use in a particular context, right? So let's just pretend that's the case. Now, one of the things that you can do, and I should say up front, so we have some really great guidance from the Department of Industry, the National AI Center, et cetera, et cetera. We have great guidance from UNESCO, different bodies in the EU. There's lots of great places you can go for practical resources on how to do responsible AI better, right? Everything I'm saying here is not instead of that. It's in conjunction with doing those best practices, right? And that's really important. So this approach that we're talking about here encourages us as a team to ask questions through different ethical lenses. when we say lens, we're talking sort of about moral theories. And I'm not going to get into all of this stuff, but I do provide resources that give you a really grounded but quite simple and quick to get through understanding of what these theories are, or these lenses, where they kind of come from, what their pros and cons are. In moral philosophy, there's no one sort of theory to rule them all. And I think when we're doing practical applied ethics, we tend to be best served by thinking about different theories and considering how they can together inform the justification of our actions, like the process that we go through to go, yeah, that's the best direction. That's most aligned to our values. That's the one that best upholds people's rights. It's most fair. It's most likely to deliver the greatest net benefit. It's considering the common good. It aligns to kind of how we want to be as an organization, the types of values that we want to uphold. And it's demonstrating our care beyond just ourselves, right? So these are the types of simple questions that you can be asking when you're looking at, hey, should we do A or B? And what I've done here is I've shown, like, I often use something like a Likert scale, right? So I might go, all right, we've got two options. So I'm going to use a Likert scale from 1 to 7. I'm going to run through these types of questions and I'm going to score it. So let's say, all right, I've got option A that I'm looking at here, and I'm going, okay, does option A respect the rights of all who have a stake in this project? Gosh, I think it sort of does for these reasons, but there's these things that I'm uncertain about. And so what you do is, let's say you score it a five out of 7. And then you add a couple of dot points to justify. And then you go, all right, for option A, which option treats people fairly, giving them each what they are due? Because of these things that we're considering, because of this stuff that we don't, I'm going to give it a 4. And you note that down. You go through this process and then you do it for option B. And what you come out of that process with is a score, an overall score. So you've got your questions, you can then divide it by the total number, which basically gives you a simple average. And you can compare and contrast option A versus option B. Now, this doesn't it's not as simple as it makes the decision for you, but it can really aid your decision-making process. And why does it not make your decision for you? Because you still got to engage in your processes of collective reasoning. You've also got to consider the business values, because you have objectives or goals or aspirations that are passed down from the top. You have different constraints, right? Oh, we've got to get this done in this period of time. And, there's this critical path dependency here, here, and here, right? So this is just part of your decision-making process, part of how we do good, rigorous decision-making. It's not the only thing that we do. So that's one of the approaches. And one of the references that I provide, that I'll get to at the end, talks you through or guides you through how to do this process. And honestly, it's really simple. You can sketch it on the back of a napkin. You can do it in a workshop. You can add these types of questions into simple rituals. You could add some sense check of this into something like a daily stand-up. You could add it into a retrospective. There are lots of different ways in which you can embed and integrate this into your existing ways of working. Again, remembering the BJ Fogg thing, we don't want to introduce too much new work such that it's difficult to do. We want to find ways to integrate this into the ways that you're already working so that there's a greater likelihood that you do it and that it benefits you. All right, example 2. This is a little bit more complex. Now, let's say you've gone through that process we've described above and you're like, we really don't know a lot about the potential consequences. So we think, and we're just sort of doing a back of the napkin type thing here, we think that it probably is going to be good overall. But because what we're doing might be, kind of high risk in these ways, we think we need to spend more time thinking about the consequences so that we can actually make an assessment, a logical, well reasoned, sort of defensible assessment of whether or not this is likely to deliver, net good, more positive than negative effects. So this is a process called consequence scanning. And it's quite similar to the types of approaches that risk and business continuity and disaster preparedness practitioners have been using for quite some time, where they look at the context of an organization and they go, what's the landscape of consequential uncertainty, and consequential uncertainty is basically just what they call risk. And then they map that out and they go, well, how likely is this to happen? What's the effect if, like, what's the magnitude of the effect? Like, how big is the effect if it were to happen? And then they start thinking about, well, what are the things that we can do to increase the likelihood of these good effects and decrease the likelihood of these bad effects? And this process here teaches you how to do that. Now, we've seen this used in a lot of tech companies over the years because an organization in the UK called Everyone, which is now housed, I believe, within something called the Ada Lovelace Institute, started publishing about something quite like this. Um, and I have found it to be particularly useful at the start of like a new project, and then something that you can come back to and version control at different intervals. So you could have like a quarterly review or something like that. It's not something that you're going to be doing every day, but it is something that you can integrate into existing ways of working at, say, the start of a given project. And then when you're doing slightly more rigorous or robust sort of reflection on what the effects of this new product or service that you've built has been. Now, with that out of the way, I'm just going to go over to the resources here quickly and talk about a few of them. And then hopefully we have a bunch of time for questions. I'm hoping that this has raised um, curiosities or concerns or queries or however you might want to frame it. Now, I'll zoom in really quickly. I'll just get you to follow me quickly. So this overview of ethics in tech practice, that's the one I was talking about from Santa Clara University. Brilliant. Highly recommend checking that out. Highly recommend checking that out. It's one of the best overviews that I've found, and the team there is really brilliant as well, that will give you a good understanding of some of the important theories that can help inform your practical ethics in the context of building AI systems or any other systems. It's sort of context agnostic, and it guides you through the process of doing it. It's really brilliant. What else have we got here? So these two over here. So this is the one on the meta crisis. If you're interested in that bigger picture stuff, it's a really wonderful overview. This is a direct overview of how to run consequence scanning workshops. This one talks about how to do both activities, consequence scanning and the first one, which is basically like principles reflection, in very small organizations. So one of the common concerns that we have is, yeah, this is all good and well, but we're just a startup and it's really hard for us to justify these types of things. Totally get that. A lot of stuff is existential when you're a startup. Much earlier in my career, I was a CEO of a venture-backed startup, and you're trying to be highly effective with very limited resources often, and you've got competing priorities and everything you do is an opportunity cost. And I learned way back then, this is a long time ago now, to try and do this stuff within those practical constraints as well as we possibly could. Doing ethics is not about perfection. It really is just every day about trying to do that little bit better. And, aligning our everyday actions to our aspirations. There's a bunch of other stuff in here, some of it a bit more technical, some of it a bit less technical, that I'm hoping may be of interest to you. And with that, Amir, maybe we come back and we have a bit of a yarn.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thanks, Nate. That was great. And I hope everybody managed to sort of jump in and get links, access to these links. If they can't, we'll make sure we'll get it off Nate, and he can potentially also share it via LinkedIn.
Totally.
By all means, put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. I think we're a small group, but I had a couple of questions while people are simmering on what you've said. Maybe I'll start with my first one. So, looking at your first example, words such as like fairly or do most good are captured, right? Given that as humans we're all different, we have different values across the spectrum. If I'm sitting there and doing, let's say, the first exercise with, let's say, one person or a business analyst and a dev and the CEO and the board member and whatever, how do you ensure everybody's definition of fair or everyone's definition of, most good is aligned. You almost need to do a step beforehand to go, look, when we mean good, what do we mean? Great, capture that. So now when we do the exercise, like, does that reflect that principle of good? Like, because it can be very complex, right?
Yeah, it can. And it's a really good question, mate. So before we do any sort of ethical decision-making process well, and we can justifiably expect like it really helps our business, or in a governmental context it helps our government department or whatever, we do need to do some groundwork. Often it's not a heap of groundwork up front, because what one of the uses of these types of processes is it surfaces the implicit stuff that we
Hmm.
sometimes need to make more explicit.
Mm.
So there are different ways that you could do it. You could, most organizations have corporate value statements, right? Now, big problem here, and we have good empirical literature on this. On average, there isn't even a statistical correlation between corporate value statements and the way that corporations behave.
Hmm.
The big issue. That's a
Mm.
systemic lack of integrity, right? And a lot of my work is focused on that, right? How do we close that gap? Again, it's not about perfection. How do we meaningfully close that gap so that we can become more integrous organizations that do more good in the world? So we can start with where we're at, like say our corporate value statements, or we can start with other resources that we have. And then we can do like basic or participatory design to try and figure out, well, what do we mean by this?
Mm.
Now, in utilitarian ethics, we often mean quite specific. Now, there are different schools of utilitarian ethics and consequentialism more broadly, right? And different philosophers have proposed different ways of doing this. What matters, however, for the purpose of such a process is that we work productively and respectfully with the inherent tension that arises through a process like this. So, a big part of ethics is learning to dialogue. Now,
Mm.
dialogue, so the root of debate basically means to beat down another. That's kind of so that we don't want to debate. That's not what we're interested in. We're interested in journeying together, enhancing our shared understanding so that we can be more effective, more collaborative, enhance our coordination, etc. You know what I mean? So it's not about debate, it's about dialogue. Um, so through dialogue, we surface the different tensions. Or, hey, I kind of think this. Or from my cultural upbringing, we often come at it this way. And we can hold this stuff in tension. And then we can compare and contrast that with the way that philosophers have argued these things, simple versions of the way that philosophers have argued these things over the years. And then we go, all right, here's our starting point. Here's our working definition of what we mean by this. And here are the ways that we think about it. Here are the ways that we try and uphold that. So the whole process often forces us to take stuff that's often like implicit and frankly, mate, taken for granted and make it a bit more explicit. And when we do that, yes, there is some tension that rises to the surface. But if we have the right kind of attitude, and we're
Mm.
doing so in a fairly healthy organizational culture, often what that does is that surfaces clarity and coherence that we've literally never had before. And it means that we can go, closer to full steam ahead with like more effectiveness. I won't just say efficiency, but more effectiveness than we've ever had. And that's one of the things that so because I've done this in so many different ways, in so many different contexts over so many years, I see these patterns playing out, right? But it's often most powerful to kind of prod and prompt and create favorable conditions. And then when I'm working with organizations, let them realize a good chunk of this stuff themselves. Not all of it. We create a nice sort of scaffolding, but realize this stuff themselves, because the insights are much richer that way. People then own the work more and it becomes more intrinsically motivating. But it's a great question and it's so common. You can't avoid it. But there are many different ways to healthily navigate it so that we then go through that process and a better place to do better work going forward.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Even in a design space, you start with dialogue and conversations, get some alignment,
Totally.
or highlight the misalignment, and you have to solve that first before you actually step forward. So that makes sense.
Exactly.
While we wait for anybody else who's got a question, I've got a second one. It's probably more of I guess, more useful one. In your work, and let's just stick within the Australian context,
Sure.
any organizations, government departments, anybody that's doing this well, and by well, I mean consistently, regularly, like you said, it's not a do it once and tick the box, but are doing it well as a process to try and get to a better outcome. I'm not necessarily caring that the outcome is that great, but the process of going through this, who's doing it well or actively doing it?
Well, mate, so a lot of organizations are giving it a crack to a greater or lesser extent,
Okay.
right? Organizations will have corporate ethics functions. Some organizations will have like ecological ethics functions because they're focused on sustainability and
Yeah.
planetary boundaries
Yeah.
and all that stuff, which is really important. Organizations are material organisms, if you will. They have big effects on the world. Organizations often like kind of like what we think of as business ethics and other applied ethicsy approaches often sit within kind of like some type of corporate governance function. Sometimes there's a bit of an overlap with risk. Um, that can work more or less well depending on the context. I'm not sort of like dogmatically bound to any particular way of doing it. One of the challenges that we have though is that not many organizations open the kimono, so to speak, and go, hey, here's the entirety of our ethical decision-making processes for you
Mm. Mm.
to query and challenge and to hold us accountable. Um, and there are lots of different reasons why organizations are sort of disincentivized from doing that. I think we ought to try and move in that direction. I think that would be really great for public discourse, for the coherence and integrity of democratic process, for holding corporations to account for a lot of the things that they say they're going to do, and then all of a sudden, 3 years later, they go, we're not doing that anymore. A great example under some of the political changes that have occurred recently in the US, we've seen a lot of these corporations go, well, we're not making those commitments anymore.
Mm. Mm.
Google used to have some. There's like Google's had a shaky track record with AI ethics, a very shaky track record at best, firing a lot of their best people, not doing the things that they say they're going to do. But now they've just really toned down a lot of that stuff. And other corporations have done a similar thing. So, mate, it is hard. I've seen and I've been privy to a number of examples where organizations have done very well in a certain context, like say a particular business function or on a particular project. And an organization that I have a very good long-standing relationship with, I'm not working with actively at the moment, but TELUS in Canada, they have a very robust data and trust business function with about 100 people, and they service the rest of the organization, and they try to do this stuff very well. And I was part of the team that built their sort of socio-technical system for ethical decision making. That's a bunch of fancy words, but a more robust way to systematize the components of this or the parts of this process that can be systematized and then still create space for the dialogue and the deliberation and whatnot. Mate, I wish I had a simpler answer for you.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
but for all of those reasons, it's a bit tricky. Um, with that said, what I think you can do if you're looking for inspiration is potentially look at some of the guidance that comes from, say, the really good responsible AI program guidance or ethically aligned design from the IEEE, which is a very robust resource.
Mm.
Or look at the work from the folks at Santa Clara, the Markula Center for Applied Tech Ethics. Look to that sort of stuff. Um, and I would be trying to draw inspiration from that instead of going, where's the best reference point? Because of all those reasons I described, and particularly because very few organizations are transparently communicating what they're actually doing internally, it's hard to know how well they're doing or how poorly they're doing. I wish I had a
No,
better answer, mate, but that's the only honest one I can give.
no, that's a valid point. It makes a lot of sense, like you said, because of the corporate governance and the risk associated, especially if you're a publicly listed company, right? Like
Totally,
you do is
totally.
expose yourself and have a longer term impact on the biggest system of shareholders and directors and so forth. Awesome. I don't think everyone's a bit shy and quiet here, but I think it could be that, or it could be that they're still sort of pondering about everything that you've said and having some thoughts around what they could do next. I did share the ethics canvas as well in the chat. That's something that I've shared with many people. It sort of covers the same thing. I love a good canvas. It basically breaks it down into modules and asks similar type of questions that you've sort of proposed here, Nate. So you'll make your obviously we can take it offline, but we'll share the resources here. I love
Totally.
oh, we've got another question. That's good. But we'll share these resources and people can take it from here. But we've got a
Nice.
question from Kelsey. How would you engage with a community about AI that has a mostly negative view about it? So we're talking community as the externally customers and users. Nate,
Um,
interesting.
well, it's a brilliant question. Um, so maybe some other resources I can provide. Not many people have studied the history of AI and informal parlance, like the sort of like historicity, like what is the truth of its history? Because there are lots of stories about its history, but it's like which stories should we give most credence to? Which are most sort of most truthful? Um, a lot of folks know that formally there was a body of work that kicked off amongst computer scientists, cognitive scientists, etc., who were very interested in figuring out if computational processes could help us better understand organismic intelligence. Don't say that too fast. But particularly human intelligence, right? The capacity that we have for, like, incredible capacity that we have for general problem solving. Um, and that kicked off in 1957. But actually, there's quite a rich mythological history that informed a lot of the things that led up to that and informed a lot of the stuff that is occurring now. There's a podcast called the Emerald Podcast. Josh Schray runs it, and I think it was either last year or the year before. It might have been the year before, 2023. And the name of it was something like "So You Want to Be a Sorcerer." And it was about bringing some of that mythological history into the public awareness because not a lot of folks have studied that. Now, I can provide academic articles that talk about this, the historicity of this that might be useful. Now, why do I frame it that way? Because we're pretty wrapped up in the Silicon Valley narrative about AI, and a lot of it is BS. Now, they're incentivized to say certain things about the abilities of these systems, the way that they're interpreting the phenomena, the trajectory that we're on, and then
Mm.
the opportunities that that affords us. But for various different reasons, they're probably the least credible folks that we should be listening to. So there are lots of reasons to be skeptical of that AI rhetoric. Lots of reasons to be skeptical of that AI rhetoric. So one of the things that I would do is if I was speaking to a community like this, I'd be like, hey, the history of AI is a bit more colorful and much more diverse and interesting than a lot of people think. And it kind of looks like this. The other thing is a lot of the AI agenda and narrative and funding, etc., is being driven by people in these positions who have these incentives. Many of the incentives are super perverse.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and so there's probably good reason to not give too much credibility to that. And when you do that type of thing, what you do is you kind of often bring people in off the ledge because you go, oh, they're like, oh, this person gets it. They're not dogmatically buying into AI will save the world, or it's the best thing since sliced bread, or everyone's going to lose their job tomorrow, or it's going to solve the climate crisis, or any of these ridiculous notions, right? Oh, this person's quite grounded. All right, cool. And then you're able to start building up a sense of, oh, all right, well, if those things are kind of useful to think about, well, how else could we think about AI? Well, it's AI basically works in these ways, and you demystify the functioning of the thing. And you go, oh, but it's not just sort of math or statistics. It's got all of these different problems because it's been trained on these types of
Mm.
text and they have all of these different biases and yada yada yada, and you go, oh well, but it's also material. It's not something in the ether. It's like we have to use earth materials and water and cooling systems, and so you can build up a picture to help people understand, like, what we're really talking about is all of this stuff, and it's okay to be not just skeptical, but negative. But what if for a second we just sat with all of that and we went, okay, well, what do we do now? Where do we go with this thing? How might we want to engage with this or disengage from it? in a way that does align to our values? What are the types of things that we can do to support one another, to more wisely stewarding not just the development, but our usage of this thing? How can we sense make through that process of together? Now, I know there's a lot that I included just there, but those are the types of things that I would be considering in such a process. And very importantly, like all human beings and social primates for that matter, so it's broader than just Homo sapiens and even hominids, it's like we have the need, the fundamental need to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued by important others. This is non negotiable. And if those needs are not being met or not being healthily met, we have problems, either individually or collectively. So when you're engaged in a process like that, the worst thing that you can do is dismiss the person or talk
Mm,
down their
mm,
concerns or whatever it might be, because then they don't
mm.
feel seen, heard, and valued. So you start with ensuring that they know, like you care for them, you care for this context that you share, you see them, you hear them, you value them, and maybe potentially, if you're an expert, you can bring some other ways of seeing the past, the present, and the possible futures into their purview, and you can support them and engage in them in that dialogical process. Remember, it's not about debate; it's about journeying together towards shared understanding, shared coherence, etc. Hopefully, that's helpful. I know there was a lot in there.
Now you've pretty much sold a fundamentals workshop course through that. So just to Kelsey to expand on that. One of the things, so we have a sort of 1 day workshop that we run. It's very much fundamentals, it's not very technical. And basically all the ingredients that Nate talked about is what we cover. People coming from different um I guess areas of the spectrum, from totally negative to totally positive, often misguided and not understanding sort of like the fundamentals of how it works and where it's come from, where it's going. So in our training, we sort of demystify a lot of things and create a shared understanding of how the technology works, what resources does it use, the potential risks and the positive aspects. And by the end of the workshops, individuals are in a better position to make a decision by themselves as opposed to make decision based on media, left wing, right wing, US. And
Totally.
so forth. So I
Totally.
think, I guess to summarize that, I think just foundational education is really, really important for a technology such as thing that's either misunderstood, moving really rapidly, and lots of noise around it. So we need to be able to sort of filter the noise out.
Yeah, 100%, mate. And just like there are so many reasons to be concerned, and they're probably not the Terminator ones, at least as far as we can tell scientifically. But like it's exacerbating a lot of different social issues. It's going to make a lot of like we're already becoming less and less sort of coherent in any type of democratic-ish way. It's having a huge effect on planetary boundaries, really resource intensive technology. And there's not much good reason to think that it's going to make that stuff better. So like, yeah, I think we got to sit with those really justifiable skepticism. I've seen the other part of this question here as well, mate. Thanks, Kelsey, for that's a really good one. So I do some work in the arts as well. My brother runs a record label, and we kind of do some work together there. And my partner is sort of like a transdisciplinary artist, and I do some collaborative work with her. I would never claim that I'm an artist, but sort of uh, dabbling and expressing those those parts of my being. But there's a lot of discourse around this stuff, and it's very challenging because, and I'm just going to pitch this a slightly different way, maybe than you would have expected. But right now, we're interacting via satellite, right?
Mm,
Nothing that has resulted from evolutionary process, i.e., as an adaptation, um, has given us the ability to interact the way that we're interacting. Studying our evolutionary history and how significant our current, like the current state of the world is to that, can help make sense of some, certainly very meaningfully, but not all challenges that we face, but certainly some of them very meaningfully. In the past, if you said something horrible to someone, there was real physical risk to your being, right? I'm not advocating for violence or anything like that, but that was a truth of our um, like our socio-historical evolutionary context. And if you did that consistently, there would be consequences for that. Now, um, our psyches are incredibly complex, and I'm not going to get into all of the different ideas
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
posed about that, right? But our psyches are incredibly complex, and we might have very dark, horrible thoughts at times. We can choose not to act on them. They might actually mean nothing at all, but we still don't understand a lot about the human psyche, right? But when you put people into this sort of socially contagious context where the algorithm actually promotes more and more divisive, extremist sort of content, which isn't particularly reflective of most people's views of things. And you are effectively rewarded through that process
Mm,
through different forms of, frankly, utterly meaningless engagement, which hijacks your neurochemistry, neuroendocrine system, yada, 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 all this stuff, right? And there are no physical consequences for you acting a particular way, then you're going to get this extreme divisiveness, binary sort of stuff. So what I would suggest, at least as a starting point, is maybe experimenting outside of that context in um, situations that can be more discourseful, where you can actually engage in dialogue, where it can be healthy and interesting and respectful, and where the tension of difference and diversity can be a beautiful rather than terrifying thing. And see what you might learn out of that. So I am suggesting take it offline or into different spaces as a starting point. And then from there, maybe start experimenting with ways that you can encourage different types of thinking in these. I'm not suggesting go off social media. That's your choice, right? But maybe take it into different contexts as a starting point. See what you can learn, and then in these more open sort of public social media type contexts, if that's what you are referring to, progressively try different approaches and see if it works. But maybe don't be too like sort of outcome dependent. It could be that the way that you want to engage with people and the integrity with which you want to engage is just not really afforded in that context. That might be a possibility that you have to be open to.
mm. And I think, look, it's a tough one, right? When you're talking social media, you're talking, again, people from different walks of life, different agendas, different levels of understanding and education. And I think, Kelsey, with that, there's just really, um, I guess, the early stages of this technology where there's still a lot of misunderstanding of the technology, the good and the bad. And unfortunately, sort of the people who are early adopters and early innovators will suffer because, the great majority who still don't understand this technology will have their own opinions on either side and are in a position of power to make a decision to cancel someone, to cancel a contract, to not give them that work. So it is going to be hard, and it comes down to how quickly this generation and the next generation start to understand and be educated, the good and the bad, and the neutral aspect like Nate's talked about. So in that time, I think, like Dave said, you either take it offline or how forthcoming and transparent do you need to be? It is a really, really tough one. And it's probably, again, when I run these workshops, often, there's 20 people in a room from a corporate, and they're literally half the people on one side of the fence, half in a total other side of the fence, and it's and my role is sort of bring them back down to sit on the fence, so they can start having that conversation. So that's really hard to do in a public forum like social media. So anyway, thank you, Kelsey, for sharing your thoughts and challenges. I think I love it. And again, we could be talking for hours and hours with Nate. But I just want to say thank you very much, Nate, for sharing your wisdom with us. It was a really great topic to start the year with. Hopefully, people got a lot of homework. They're going to go and do a lot of reading. And over the coming weeks, we'll share, the recordings and any resources. And also, we'll share the next topic that's going to be in roughly mid-March. So thanks for everybody who joined us. And again, thank you very much, Nate. And it was a pleasure having you here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. And yeah, good luck with this, everyone.
Thanks
It's been
all.
a turbulent few years, but I think there's real potential in the
Absolutely.
future.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks, everyone. Talk soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye.